In America in the 19th century, spiritualism was very big. People come to believe that making contact with the dead was possible, and many become interested in this in a desperate attempt to contact lost loved ones. Because of the spiritualism boom, self-claimed psychics were making a living from claiming to be able to contact the dead by performing a seance. The dead would make contact by either rapping on the tables or walls, or even talking through the medium. Now, there were two sisters who lived in New York, who were mainly responsible for the boom in psychics and seances. Their names were Margaret and Kate Fox. Back in 1848, they claimed they contacted the ghost of a gentleman who had been murdered in their New York home. Their story was reported in the newspapers, which encouraged more spiritualists to follow suit and hold seances, many of them being charlatans who preyed on the grieving of people who had lost relatives dear to them. Now, these psychics, charlatans or not, they were making money left, right and centre. It was a good time for them. They were making really good money. But then the Ouija board was introduced to the public, and this seemed to put a little bit of a dampener on their career choices. Now, the idea behind the Ouija board had been around before its official release, although it was in a different format. For example, a simple paper and pen or a whiteboard could be used by the psychics who would write down messages from beyond given to them from the supposed spirits. And then of course you have table tipping, which was used as well. In 1886, it was reported that a new mysterious item known as a talking board was becoming very popular among spiritualists in Ohio. The talking board was more or less what we know today as a Ouija board. As I said, it was reported in a newspaper, and the article was seen by Mr. Charles Kennard, who instantly saw an opportunity to produce a great novelty item. Now, Charles Kennard wasted no time, and he managed to pull together a small group of investors and created the Kennard Novelty Company. The Ouija board was officially born when Mr. Elijah Bond, one of the investors, filed for a patent on May the 28th, 1890. Almost a year later, the patent was granted, and the board was officially on the market, branded under the Kennard Novelty Company. Apparently, the board was used right there in the patent office to prove that it did indeed work. Now, this bit I did find interesting. Rumour has it that the patent officer assured the patent would be successful if the board could successfully spell out his name, which was unknown to Elijah Bond. And as legend has it, the board did indeed spell out the patent officer's name. Now, who's to say that Elijah Bond didn't see the gentleman's name wrote down on a piece of correspondence, a piece of mail in the room or on his office door? We don't know, but this is how the legend goes, that Elijah Bond did not know the name of the man, and the board did indeed spell out his name. I mean, if you like the idea of that, then you're going to love this. It's also rumoured that the board named itself. Apparently, it was Kennard and Bond's sister-in-law, a Miss Helen Peters, who was an apparent medium, who all gathered around to ask the board what it would like to be named. And the board apparently spelled out O-U-I-J-A, and of course that spelled out Ouija. And when the group asked what Ouija meant, what it translated to, the board told them it meant good luck. However, it was later revealed that Peters, Bond's sister, was wearing a locket that had the name Ouida on it, inside of it. It's spelled O-U-I-D-A. Ouida was the name of an English novelist, and Peters was an avid reader of Ouida. And this may have caused Peters to subconsciously make the board spell out Ouija. Another theory is that Ouija was chosen because it sounded Egyptian. Due to the popularity of everything Egyptian at the time, in that time in history when there was newly discovered mysteries being found all the time in Egypt by archaeologists. I mean, in fact, it was also branded as an Egyptian look board, as well as a talking board and a Ouija board. Another theory is that Ouija is a combination of the French and the German word for yes, oui and ja. Put them together and you have Ouija, although this is believed to be false, and the version people normally sway to is the naming by Helen Peters and a possible favourite novelist. I mean, anyway, all that aside, the patent was accepted and the Ouija board hit the market. And then we fast forward to 1891, in the Pittsburgh Dispatch newspaper on the 1st of February 1891, the first known advertisement for the Ouija board was published. The advert for the Ouija board was printed alongside adverts for sewing machine sales, merchant tailors, and an advert for removing facial hair. And the write-up for the Ouija board was printed above all of these. And after a little bit of searching on the internet, I actually found the advertisement, which was in the Pittsburgh Dispatch newspaper, and here's what it said. Right at the top of the advertisement is the word Danzigers and Company. It seems to be a toy and novelty shop what was advertising the new item. And then it goes on to say, always the first to introduce any new novelty. This time, Ouija, or the wonderful talking board. The Ouija is without doubt the most interesting, remarkable and mysterious production of the 19th century. Its operations are always interesting and frequently invaluable, answering as it does questions concerning the past, present and future with marvellous accuracy. It furnishes never-failing amusement and recreation for all classes, while for the scientific or thoughtful, its mysterious movements invite the most careful research and investigation, apparently forming the link which unites the known with the unknown, and the material with the immaterial. It forces upon us the conviction that a great truth was contained in the statement of the Danish prince. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than were ever dreamed of in thy philosophy. And then just underneath the price is printed, which was $1.49. And then it says, come and see this wonderful game. Always the cheapest. Danzigers, 6th Street and Penn Avenue. Now, as you can tell from that advert, there's no real mention of ghosts or demons or any dark intentions. It's advertised as more of a mysterious, fun parlour game. It's even described as a game right there in black and white, a new novelty to own. And apparently there was no real instructions or explanations as to why the board worked, and this probably left a lot to the imagination and helped sales in the board's early years. It's also known as a spirit board, or a talking board. The Ouija board is a flat board normally made out of wood, but doesn't have to necessarily be made out of wood, it can be made out of anything. In the top left hand corner of the board is the word yes. In the top right hand corner of the board is the word no. In between yes and no is normally the word Ouija, but not always. In the middle of the board you will find printed all 26 letters of the alphabet, and then directly underneath the alphabet you will find the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 0. And then directly underneath the numbers you will see the word goodbye. You also have a separate item that comes with the board, which is called a planchette. It's normally in the shape of a teardrop or a heart, and it's a very light piece of plastic with a small window normally in the middle of the planchette, which enables you to see the letters and the numbers of the board as you move the planchette over them. And the aim of the game is to ask the board a question. It's recommended that you play with 2 or more players. The players would lightly touch the planchette, ask her questions, and watch in amazement as the planchette seemingly moves from letter to letter, spelling out the answer to the question they asked. And the next part is said to be very important. Before ending your session, you must always move the planchette to goodbye, to close the doorway between worlds. And the board was a massive success for Mr. Kennard, and it was probably responsible for the growth of the company. In 1893, Kennard and Bond stepped out of the business due to work-related problems, internal pressures and all that kind of stuff. And this is when a gentleman named William Fuld steps into our story. He took the reins of the business and the rights to the Ouija board, which made him very rich, right up until his death, which eerily has a connection to the board. Fuld died in 1927 after he plummeted from the roof of one of his factories, which in life he claimed the Ouija board in fact instructed him to build. Here's another fun fact. William Fuld's gravestone is actually designed to look like a Ouija board. I mean, it's got the yes and no in the top corners, it's got the alphabet in the middle, the numbers underneath, and the goodbye, all there on this beautiful white headstone. So at this part in our story in the history of the board, we're in the 1900s, and the Ouija board is as popular as ever, loved by the general public but hated by psychics and mediums who were trying to make a living off the so-called gifts. I mean, look at it from their point of view, they're making a living off doing psychic readings, and then all of a sudden this new novelty item comes out, the Ouija board, and it's inexpensive. It's easy to buy, you can get it in the toy aisle of any good novelty shop. So like I said, from the public's point of view, why would you pay the asking price of a psychic when you could just go out, buy a Ouija board and get all the answers to your questions in the comfort of your own home, sat with your family, and you could ask the board whatever you wanted without judgment from any other people. And what you've got to remember at this point in time, the board was just a mystical family entertainment novelty item, just seen as a board game, and that's what it was. It was just a board game when it came out, outselling the likes of Monopoly. But the Ouija board was about to become a lot more popular at a time when history was probably at one of its darkest points and people really needed something to believe in. On the 28th of July 1914, World War I commenced and lasted long over 4 years. Millions upon millions of lives were lost. So, as you can imagine at this time in history, this left a lot of people dealing with grief and a lot of people desperate to communicate with the dead relatives. And the Ouija board was a lot of people's way to do that. And once again, sales of the board went up. As grieving wives who had lost their husbands in the war, they went out and purchased the Ouija board in one last attempt to grasp a little bit of hope and somehow contact their lost relatives. And that is how the board was viewed for a long time, just something to give people hope, a way to communicate loved ones that have been lost. And as I said before, spiritualism was very big at the time, and if it brought people a little bit of comfort and a little bit of happiness, was it really that bad? I mean, was it? I mean, even if you think the Ouija board is nothing more than a lie, if you believe the Ouija board is just pure evil and shouldn't be messed with, what you've got to remember at this point in time, it wasn't viewed like that. Like I said, it was viewed as a novelty item. So was it really that bad for people to get a little bit of hope and happiness out of it at a time when they really needed it? Well, for all the comfort the Ouija board might have been providing people at this point in history, there was also a lot of strange stories coming to light about the board. I mean, as the board grew in popularity, it started to be used in more ways than just a game. It was also used by self-claimed psychics who believed they could solve crimes by using the board. Take for instance the murder of Joseph Bone Elwell. It was reported that the murder of Joseph Bone Elwell, a successful gambler, was attempted to be solved by certain people using the Ouija board, but ultimately the crime went unsolved. It was reported that on June the 11th, 1920, Elwell was shot in the head in his own locked house, and to this day his murder has never been solved, even though many psychics claimed that they know who the murderer was by the use of a Ouija board. Ultimately, they all failed. If anything, that story probably tells us that the Ouija board doesn't work, or the person using the Ouija board didn't actually know what they were doing, but the next documented case probably sways more in the realm of mental health than spiritualism. This case tells of a woman who was committed to a psychiatric hospital for leaving her mother's dead body in the living room for 15 days before burying her in the backyard. The daughter claimed that the Ouija board had instructed her to do what she did, and she was not crazy. Now, some might say that the Ouija board was responsible for this, but I think a lot of people would sway towards the fact that the lady was probably suffering from mental health issues, and she was in fact crazy, even if she stated that she wasn't. She probably needed help. The next incident involving a Ouija board took place in 1929 near Buffalo. Leila Jimison and Nancy Bowen turned to the Ouija board for help in solving the mysterious death of Nancy Bowen's husband. They claimed that the dead husband did indeed make contact. Apparently, the dead husband named his female murderer and gave a description of the killer and address. Leila Jimison claimed that she actually knew the female killer named Cloffield, and I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly. It's worth mentioning that days after the seance, Nancy also received a mysterious letter, which informed Nancy that Clotfield was in fact a witch and had killed her husband. This was all that was needed to push Nancy over the edge, as well as the Ouija board seance. She is then said to have gone out and purchased chloroform and a hammer, knocked on Clotfield's door and murdered her with the hammer, and then placed a rag soaked in chloroform down her throat for good measure. It turned out Nancy had been set up by her friend, Leela, who was actually having an affair with Clotfield's husband and simply wanted the woman out of the way. Nancy was found guilty of manslaughter, whilst her so-called friend was acquitted. So that story points more at deception rather than it being a supernatural story. But there was also a similar case in 1933, which tells of a mother and daughter who were sat down to use a Ouija board, whilst her husband and father of the daughter was out milking the cow in Arizona. The board informed the daughter to kill her father when he had finished milking the cows, and shockingly, the mother was very supportive of this idea. When the father had finished milking the cows, his daughter made her move. She took her father's shotgun and blasted him twice in the back, resulting in his death. 2 weeks later, it was discovered that the mother had been planning the murder all along, so she could flee with another man, and had shockingly set up her own daughter to take the fall. The pair both did receive jail time, but only served roughly 3 years each. So once again, that is also a story of deception rather than supernatural. In 1935 in Kansas, a woman named Nellie Hurd was given information from a spirit whilst using a Ouija board. The board had apparently told her that her 77-year-old husband had been cheating on her, and had also hidden $15,000 from her. That night, Nellie knocked her husband unconscious. He awoke to find she had tied him to his bed, and then the brutal interrogation started, to make him confess to something he didn't actually do. She proceeded to stab him, whip him, and burn his feet with hot pokers, as well as threatening to shoot him with a pistol. Eventually he did confess, although it was a false confession. He did this just to stop his wife from inflicting any more harm upon him. Nellie momentarily left the gun on the bedside. Her husband managed to get out of his binds, grabbed the pistol, and shot his wife, killing her instantly. Rightly so, in court, he was found innocent, and that he acted purely out of self-defense. Now, it seems that the people in these stories were actually using the board as a deceitful tool, or they were genuinely mentally ill. There are many more tales of murder and deceit, but the board has also been used to progress people's personal careers as well. Take for instance the story of Lenore Curran. It was in 1913 when Lenore Curran claimed to have come in contact with a spirit named Patience Worth, who lived in the years 1649 to 1694, and lived across the sea in England. Lenore claimed that she could see Patience Worth's personal features as well as where she lived in her mind's eye. She described Patience Worth to be around 30 years old, her hair was dark red, her eyes brown, and her mouth firm and set. She also claimed that she had visions of Patience Worth travelling to America, where she was eventually killed by Indians. Lenore became a popular author with the help of the spirit Patience Worth, who apparently gave her all the ideas for her poems and novels. And when I say ideas, what I mean is Lenore said that Patience actually told her what to write. Lenore claimed that communication through the board was a regular occurrence. Eventually she began to anticipate what Patience Worth was going to spell before the planchette arrived upon the letters, and eventually Lenore started to claim to be able to see the story unfold in her mind in pictures. She claimed to actually be able to see the characters of the book playing out their scene before her very eyes. And if any of the characters spoke a different language, Patience's voice could be heard translating the language for her. As the years went on, Lenore and the spirit of Patience apparently wrote many novels together, including poems as well. Now, as far-fetched as that story does sound with the spirit writing the books, it is a little bit more plausible than the previous stories, which revolved around deceit and mental health. I mean, because ultimately we don't know. She might have been telling the truth, we don't know. It all depends how open your mind is. I mean, like always, you know me, I like to keep an open mind, and I like to think that there's a slight possibility that it could have been real. Now, let's get back to a little bit more history on the board, especially the years that the board became more associated with demonic and evil forces. The year was 1973, and a little horror movie was about to hit the cinema screens and cause absolute mayhem. The movie went by the name The Exorcist.
I'm Damien Karras. And I'm the devil. Now kindly undo these straps. If you're the devil, why not make the straps disappear? That's much too vulgar display of power, Carrie.
Now, the movie is said to be based loosely on actual events. The film tells the story of a 12-year-old girl who becomes possessed by a demon after playing with a Ouija board and making contact with a spirit called Captain Howdy. Once the movie was released, the audience flocked to see it, and that's when the negative reports started to come in. Apparently, people found the movie so disgusting and disturbing that there were reports of people actually collapsing and vomiting, and even more disturbing, people were having miscarriages and even heart attacks in the cinema. A lot of people believe that the movie itself was evil and should not be seen by anyone and should be banned. People of course still wanted to see the movie and queued in long lines in the freezing weather, as members of the church walked the lines urging people not to go and see the movie. In fact, I believe it was released briefly in the UK in the 80s on VHS, and then it was quickly taken off sale until its DVD release in 1999. And to be honest, it's not surprising, although nowadays the movie probably doesn't seem that graphic compared to some of the horror movies we see today. There were many disturbing scenes, including the possessed girl using foul language, urinating on herself, the scene where her head spins all the way around, and of course the masturbation scene with the cross, which still to this day is quite disturbing to watch. And as I stated before, the reason for the possession in the film was all because the main character, Regan, played with a Ouija board and invited in the demon, Captain Howdy. I mean, if the Ouija board was ever looked upon in a negative fashion in the past, after the release of this movie, it was now 10 times worse. Suddenly, the Ouija board went from being a mystical board game to an evil contraption of dark forces and a doorway to demonic evil, if that's how you see it. Another reason that the board was now seen in this light was due to the Exorcist movie apparently being based on actual real events that actually happened to a young boy in Maryland in 1949 who had been introduced to the Ouija board by his aunt, who was a fan of spiritualism. The boy's aunt died shortly after introducing him to the Ouija board, and apparently that's when the boy became possessed. William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist, claims he took the info from this case, changed the characters, and built a story around the facts for his 1971 book. In the story, the boy's name is Roland Doe, although this is a pseudonym. He's also been named Robbie Mannheim. Now, as I said before, the story is said to be based on true events, and I think it's a perfect way to end today's episode by retelling the story that probably is responsible for giving the Ouija board its connection with demonic possession and evil intent. And in the story, we'll be referring to the boy as Roland. As I said, it was 1949. Roland's grandmother, who introduced him to the Ouija board, had just passed away. This is when the possession started to take hold. The boy was only 14 years old. The boy started to complain that scratching noises, dripping pipes and strange noises were coming from every part of his bedroom, and his bed would start to move and violently shake, just like in the movie. And also, household objects were witnessed being thrown by unseen forces when the boy was near. The boy's family eventually sought help for all the paranormal happenings in the house. They desperately needed help, and the boy's mind seemed to be slipping further and further away as the days went on. And help did arrive, in the form of doctors, ministers and psychiatrists, but unfortunately none were able to offer any help. The family originally sought help from their own pastor, Luther Miles Schulz. Schulz was fascinated with parapsychology and asked if he could keep the boy at his house overnight to observe the strange things that had been occurring, and apparently that night Schulz did indeed witness objects flying across the room, and the boy's strange behaviour got worse. Knowing that this was out of his league, Schulz suggested that the family seek out the help of a Catholic priest. Enter Edward Hughes, a Roman Catholic priest who would go on to perform the first of many exorcisms on the boy. The boy's condition had worsened, and he was being kept at Georgetown University Hospital. It seemed necessary that the boy should be restrained, so he was strapped down to the bed to prevent any harm from happening to him. during the exorcism that was performed by the priest Edward Hughes. The boy somehow managed to free his arm from the restraints. He reached under the mattress, pulled loose one of the bed springs, and then slashed at the priest's arm, cutting him from elbow to wrist. The exorcism was ended immediately, as the priest was in desperate need of stitches. Shortly after, the boy received scratch marks all over his body, which was said to be coming from unseen forces. One of the scratches spelled out the word Lewis. When Roland's mother saw that the scratch marks spelled out Lewis, she somehow come to the conclusion that they needed to travel to St. Louis, where they had family living there. The family eventually arrived at their relative St. Louis home, and it wasn't long before they contacted Father Walter H. Halloran and Reverend William Bowden. These two men would once again attempt an exorcism on the boy with help of assistants, but not one exorcism, but one of many. Bowden and Halloran did report that during the day the boy did seem somewhat normal, and it was only when the night came and he was placed in bed that the activity would begin. More reports were made of objects flying through the air, thrown by an unknown force. The boy apparently slipped in and out of trance-like states and made strong guttural sounds that seemed impossible that they could come from him. Also, the scratches on the boy's skin also appeared more and more as the many exorcisms took place. This also included a scratch on the boy's thigh in the shape of a pitchfork, and the shape or letter X on his chest, possibly a Roman numeral. This led many to believe that the boy was being possessed by not one demon, but 10. The exorcism continued, but it seemed no positive outcome was showing. Roland began spurting out foul language, lashing out more and more, and urinating in his bed. At this point, the parents, being at their wits' end, decided to admit Roland into a hospital once again. It's in this hospital that the story, fact or fiction, comes to an end. It was on April the 18th, the Monday after Easter. Roland started to have multiple seizures, yelling at the priests that Satan would always be with him. At this point, the priests placed crucifixes, holy trinkets and rosemary beads on the boy's body, and they all began to demand that Satan leave and prayed for St. Michael to appear and defeat Satan. A grueling 7 minutes later, Roland came out of his trance-like state and simply said, "He's gone." He then went on to describe what he'd seen whilst he had been possessed. He claimed to have seen St. Michael battle Satan on a great battlefield, and Satan was defeated. And there you have it. That is the supposed true story behind the Exorcist movie. The story was first published in the Washington Post in 1949 and disappeared from the public for 2 decades. The diaries of Halloran and Bowden were somehow revealed to the public, and it's from these diaries that William Peter Blatty wrote his novel The Exorcist, which was responsible for the movie and ultimately responsible for the evil associated with the Ouija board, which all started with the alleged possession of a 14-year-old boy in Maryland. Now, many believe that the Ouija board is nothing more than a game, a harmless game that is controlled by the player's subconscious, even if they realise it or not. And they've actually given a name to this. It's called the ideomotor effect. This is a psychological condition where people make certain motions unconsciously. If you break down the words, here's what you get. Ideo meaning idea or mental representation, and motor meaning muscular action. And the idea is that muscular movement can occur, but on a subconscious level. You're not actually aware that you're doing it, and your brain doesn't connect the two together. So, take this for example. A group of people are sat around a Ouija board, and they think they've made contact with a spirit, and they ask that spirit to spell out its name. Let's say the spirit's name is Bill. So they ask it to spell out its name, and Bill successfully spells out his name. Now, the ideomotor effect suggests that the name is actually being spelled out by the people playing, and there is in fact no spirit involved at all. So this time you start again and you repeat the same Ouija board seance you did last time, and you once again ask the spirit to spell out its name. But this time, unlike the last, every player playing is to be blindfolded. Well, this time the results will more than likely be very different, spelling out not Bill, but possibly a load of gibberish. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to debunk the Ouija board, not at all. As you know from previous episodes, I just like to look on both sides, the possibility that it's real and the possibility that it might not be. You know, what if science and psychology is wrong? What if the Ouija board is in fact an object to open doors to the unknown? What if you can contact ancient demons, lost relatives and helpful spirits? I mean, many people are convinced that the board's connection to the other side is in fact real and not a trick of the mind. But what do you think? Is it a doorway to hell? A connection to the spirit world? Or a load of hocus pocus? As always, I'll let you decide.